when Claire asked me to talk about this, I was thinking, well, I would like to focus on cross-national surveys as a part of comparative survey research. I'm interested in first trying to hear also your thoughts about when and why shall we do cross-national research. Perhaps a little bit the notions of comparability, equivalence, quality, and then again comparability, since they feed on each other and there is quite a little bit of murkiness around what drives what and how we should approach it if we are thinking about sequentially. So in a sense, this is how I was trying to structure what I would have to talk about today. And then what I was thinking when we're thinking about data quality, because for me recently this is a big struggle as a secondary user, perhaps more than as a primary data producer, was to think about data quality in cross-national surveys from the point of view of the life cycle, of the survey life cycle, but focusing on design, data collection, and documentation primarily, rather than all possible steps. And of course, if that one is the case, then to think about a little bit of the taxonomy that the total survey error provides, just in terms of thinking of what one should look for, and then survey process quality management and how this informs ex-ante harmonization, whether it's input or output ex-ante harmonization. And this would be primarily from the point of view of the data producer, but then it shifts back in terms of the variability that comes into survey data through documentation to the secondary user. And here I was thinking of talking about primarily of a project that I have been struggling with for some years now, that we call the Survey Data Recycling Project. Yes, and where actually we have started from a substantive research question and got more and more involved into methodological work in the attempt of harmonizing ex post, that is trying to map into common concepts and variables information from surveys that were stemming from projects that were not a priori designed as comparative. So for example, if I would take data from the World Value Survey, which is supposedly designed as comparable within it, but then merge this data with data from the International Social Survey Project, ISSP, and European Social Survey. And then to talk a little bit about data quality from the point of view of the secondary user. And since I hope that it would be not mostly me talking, please feel free to add anything and interact and we talk. And so for me, the first question would be, I guess, when we're thinking about cross-national survey research, this idea of social sciences. And I wonder to what extent, I know that for you this is clear, that you had the hypothesis in mind, or at least the research questions in mind, when you were thinking about surveying the peculiarities of the Japanese character. How is it in your project? So when you're starting collecting this data, do you have this idea that you are going about certain research problems or research questions? Is it a more practical approach? We need to collect information on everything. In your study, the data that you're analyzing are always at the individual level. So you're analyzing the respondents of the people that were interviewed in relation to the given things, or do you also aggregate?
Aggregate, you mean?
Like comprise groups of, I don't know, ministers of...
Yeah, we have, in our list of stakeholders, we have 20 or 22 categories, and we do regroup them in 8 or 9 more general categories. Of course, we aggregate across countries, across years, I mean, and then we do
Aha, so this is what I was going at. This is what I was asking.
Yeah,
yes.
we do. That's why I'm interested. Yeah, because we do cross-country comparisons with, well, not so much cross-regional, by income level, by type of loan they get from the bank. So yeah.
So this is why I was asking, because actually when I was thinking about talking about these issues of comparability and equivalence and quality, and then again comparability, I was having in mind this context of research that we generally do with cross-national survey data, and we have the research that is more at the macro level, where we have characteristics of whatever the unit of observation was, because if we're thinking about cross-national surveys, then the unit is countries or regions or ethnic enclaves within countries, but certainly this would be why we put the people and the individuals from, in order to get a sense of this larger unit. So then when we're thinking about these issues of comparability and equivalence and again quality, it is different problems and different challenges come in whether if we do the analysis at the macro level, because sometimes, and this is why I was asking, and I would be curious to hear about your experience also, it happens that we decide that certain characteristics of country in given years, for example, if the unit of observation is the country, are derived from aggregating the responses of participants in the survey. And then some of these so-called aggregate measures derived from survey data are used as country year indicators. Right? For example, proportion of individuals who trust the political parties. This is plotted then over time. Or there are the relationships where I'm wanting to see how the proportion of people who participate in demonstrations may over time influence or not influence, I don't know, democratization level, where democratization level comes from external data, though there also it's aggregated, but not from the surveys that we collected, hopefully. And then there are micro analyses, which are very frequently, and then also the issue of comparability and equivalence and quality fits in, but a little bit different, because then it is more, and I will come back into it, it is the issue of where we're thinking about in terms of representation and measurement. But then there is also the issue of cross-level interactions, right? If you're thinking that the context in which people live determines how they answer the survey questions, and not only that, but it determines how they feel about certain issues that they are being asked about, or it influences their behavior. So then when the dependent variable is at the individual level, and then at least one independent variable is at the country year level. So when we're thinking about comparability, I would perhaps deal with two issues here, and I would think to ask whether at any point you had limitations, or I don't know, you maybe you noticed things when it comes to aggregating the data from the individual level at the characteristics of the larger unit, let's say country. So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, people do it all the time. I'm just curious how you think about it. I think one of the reasons why I was raising this here is because when we're thinking about aggregating, using measures derived from survey data as indicators of country year characteristics, then the issue is to what assumptions are we making when we are building such measures. And the first assumption is that aggregated characteristic actually represents the unit at the larger level, right? So we have to assume that that these people that we have surveyed, or that whose data we have collected from, then they would represent they would be characteristic of that country at the time. But at the same time, all the problems that we're thinking in terms of how is my instrument for data collection, in other words, how good is my measurement instrument? So all the problems, in a sense, that feed and that worry one in the measurement at the individual level are being carried over in the aggregate measure. Except that oftentimes we do not think about it anymore. In other words, we think a lot when we're thinking about the individual level measure, and we think a lot about the comparability of samples, and we think a lot about comparability of concepts, and we think a lot about functional equivalent of measurement. But most of the time, the discussions, at least I was looking in the literature, and if you have any references, I would love to hear about them, because actually we're searching for a long time for it. To where the discussion is about how aggregation cumulates or not, or whether different methods of aggregation cumulate or not the problems that are present in the measurement at the individual level. So, okay, we know that if we have item non-response, and then therefore there is systematic bias in the pattern of answers, the chances are that if I am using aggregate measures derived from such items that had item non-response and that were biased to begin with, my aggregate measure would also be a little bit iffy. So in this regard, I'm saying that when we're thinking about comparability and quality. The problems start at the micro level, and then they spread out into the different types of analysis. I see that you're a little bit quizzical. What are your thoughts about?
Oh, sorry, I'm just catching up here.
It's okay. So what the question was, what do you do survey research, and if so, in what, as data producer, as data user, what's your involvement?
I work for the Federal Government of Canada Ministry of Environment, mostly focus group kind of project management. Most of the big survey projects that we do to the general public, we kind of outsource. So I don't know.
So you're lucky in some regards.
Yeah, I don't think I have the depth of the perception that you guys do on that. But
then, so what I would like to say here is that when we're thinking about comparability, we are starting with a concept, right? Are the concepts comparable? And to what extent do we deal with emic properties or with ethic properties? That is characteristics that we may find across, and that should be common across the societal groups that we are studying. And of course, this holds for monocultural studies as well. Or we deal with characteristics that are idiosyncratic to given cultural groups, and so how can we account for those idiosyncrasies when we are thinking of measuring and comparing across countries? Because obviously we would not want to compare only what's the same, otherwise what's the purpose? And then comes in the issue of equivalence, which as a term itself, there were some presentations earlier in the conference. Tim Johnson was saying that at this point there are about 90 instances in which the term equivalence is used in the context of comparative survey research. So clearly it is not for now that we elucidate the terms, but the way I would like to think about it, and we will, as it will come up later during the presentation, is equivalence in relation to, especially to measurement, and by this taking into consideration measurement as it pertains to constructing the sample, and then we were thinking about all the steps that one can take in order to increase the comparability of the sample, but measurement in terms of how it was first early talked about by Przeworski and Toyn in terms of functional equivalence of measurement. Please take in, we don't bite. Functional equivalence of measurement, so that although the item, and then this perhaps can be extrapolated to other issues, although the item may not be identical, it captures the common, an underlying common property. And a very easy example, I do not know if any of you have this issue. So do you always, maybe I should step back. If you're thinking about, do you always use the same questions, just translated, or do you allow for variation in the question depending on the cultural context?
And then, it's about maybe 25% of the questionnaire. The rest of the questionnaire, well, most countries still keep these questions, but they have a freedom to modify these questions based on their country context, full-time program there. Yeah.
So can you give an example? You have in mind education, so socio-demographic characteristics?
Yeah, for example, I mentioned this question about development priorities. You ask about what do you think are the most important development priorities for your country. And then we have a list of 30 response options. And then, which might not be applicable in some countries, like education probably is applicable in all countries. And these are sectoral areas, I should say, sectoral areas. The bank works in different sectors, like education, health, infrastructure, but then we have something like pollution. And this might be a huge issue in some countries, while in others it's nothing. And a list of 30 or plus response options is huge, so country teams normally select to reduce it to maybe 15, 20. So this is an example.
Yes. So yeah, I think an easy example is also before '89 there was a study by Slomczynski and Kohn, who were interested in risk propensity and authoritarian conservatism versus intellectual flexibility in the US and in Poland. And in the United States, they were asking the question, how willing would you be to take the risk to open a hot dog stall? us to sell hot dogs. Well, in Romania, in Poland before '89, there was no such thing as hot dog stalls, and they would have not been able to ask this question. But they decided that they can ask actually if what is the risk that a person would be willing to take to open a kiosk where they would sell newspapers, and it worked very well. So in this sense, this idea that the items were not identical, but they did allow to capture the common underlying comparable property, which was the propensity of people to be willing to take on some risks. So then, to the extent to which actually we have this match between being able to achieve certain levels of equivalence in our measurement, but not formal equivalence necessarily, meaning that we have exactly the same things, because it may not work. And we have started with some comparability of concepts. At least we know that these concepts exist in the different society. They may vary in degree and intensity, but the given cultural context understand this context, then this in a sense also feeds into the quality of the data, because the data, no matter also how good your instrument would be, will be able, the cross-national surveys, since this is what we will be focusing here about, would be able to capture well things that have been well defined at the conceptual level. And then in turn, this further leads into comparability. So this is why oftentimes it is a struggle to make order or navigate between the comparability that we start with in terms of the research design and the research question, to the issues of equivalence, of implementation that deal primarily with the measurement, then into issues of survey quality, and this would be the next thing that I would like to talk about, and then back into the comparability of the findings and the extent to which we're confident, because in a sense this is the crucial question, to what extent what we find are real patterns, real results, rather than methodological artifacts. And in a sense, this question of how do I know, how can I be confident that what I find is real versus what I find is artifact, pertains to any of these different types of approaches to testing hypotheses, which again, I was saying that as a sociologist, I'm a little bit biased coming to the data from the point of view of actually testing research hypotheses. And when I am saying that life is not very easy, actually this is, how many of you are familiar with the Comparative Survey Design and Implementation webpage? I would say it's a very nice tool to look at. Everything is for free. It's very well organized. I put there the link, and I'm sure that the slides will be available, but we can talk afterwards. And in my view, they did an excellent job showing people with one picture why life is so difficult with survey data. Because when we are thinking about survey quality, we have to think about the entirety of the survey life cycle. And it does not end with data dissemination, because actually there are crazy people like us who take the data and reprocess it and want to harmonize ex post. So all the struggle starts again in terms of survey quality and how to think about these issues. And when the reason I thought of talking about here and trying to get ourselves a little bit through this, again, from the data producer side and from the data user side, actually to try to think about the taxonomy of errors that total survey error framework allows one to think of. And so what I wanted to say is that okay, how many of you have struggled with this total survey error and survey process quality management frameworks? Are these concepts familiar to you? Have you come across them? Did you, okay, how useful did you find them, and why or why not? So the reason why for, actually for both data producers and data users, these frameworks are helpful is again to think of them as a checklist of what to look for and what to think for, both when you're designing a survey, but also when you go later on as a user and try to understand what is in those surveys. And I took this again from the Comparative Survey Design and Implementation Guidelines website. And I put it here up. Why? Because when you're looking at it and we're thinking about total survey error, the idea is when we think about cross-national surveys or any kind of survey, what we want is to estimate and to reduce the mean square error of estimates, where this error comes both from systematic and non-systematic bias. Okay, it sounds very easy, but in practice, this is only the representation part, showing actually where potential errors come in. Now, why it is useful? First, because it shows you at the data production stage all the things that one hopefully would be able to try to minimize, because it's better to try to avoid these problems before you collect the data than have to struggle with them afterwards. But this is also useful very much. Why? Because in a sense, all this information that we see about, okay, who is the target population, what is the sampling frame, what is the sample, what are the correspondence and the match between sample, sampling frame, and target population, who are the respondents, were there post-survey adjustments, all these things have to be reflected in the documentation of any given national survey, but cross-national even more so. Why? Because in cross-national surveys, if you think that documentation of a project is dynamic, right? Supposedly, we have to document as you produce, and I will be curious to see what is your experiences with documenting your data, because I can think of myself when I do syntax, right? And then we extrapolate to documentation. But we're thinking about documentation, it's dynamic, right? When we're thinking about the documentation of cross-national surveys, you have layered dynamics, because you have multiple stages of multiple subnational, national surveys that are perhaps taken together forming the cross-national project, but most often only one wave of a cross-national project. And then there are all the subcomponents that need to be documented. So in a sense, we can think, okay, documentation is a process, but documentation is also the outcome of this process. So then there are all the elements that one needs to be documenting over or on. And this is with regards to representation, and I will read, in a sense, this issue of what are the important sources through which error creeps in the data. I will return also from the point of view of data user, how we try to think backwards when we were not involved in the process of collecting the data, whether this framework is useful for us to try to see what is measurable, because all this information here, we know it is important, but on very little is there actual data. People have started collecting paradata, right? So that is the information about the survey process. And increasingly these paradata exist, but they are very rarely shared with secondary users. Anyway, this is only the representation part of total survey error. Then there is also the measurement part. And here again, when we're thinking yet another layer through which the errors can come in to the data, and how we have to think about survey quality when we're saying, okay, when we're thinking about representation and coverage, representation and measurement, that we can try to minimize these problems. And even maybe we are or not successful, but at the very least, we document as well as possible all these elements that again speak to the survey life cycle. And this is, we will see how this is useful later on for me as a secondary user coming to the data. But at the same time, there is also the survey process quality management approach that says, wait a second, total survey error is nice, it's a lot of it, but it actually speaks to one particular subdimension of survey quality, and this is accuracy. Because at the same time, we have to understand that users of the data want this data to be comparable, they want this data to be relevant, they want this data to be timely, they want this data to be accessible, and they want this data to be interpretable. Therefore, and we have to keep in mind that actually oftentimes secondary users take for granted that the data are accurate, which leads us to a parallel problem, a simultaneous problem when we're thinking about survey quality, because what I want to say is that often we put survey quality on the shoulder of the data producer, but at the same time is the responsibility also of the user to use those data in informed fashion. In other words, if we do not bother looking into to what is in the data, and we are just glad that the data are out there, and we are running the models, it is not only the users, or it is not even primarily the user's fault that maybe the data are of varying quality on certain dimensions, especially if the data were well documented. It is the responsibility of the user to know how they are playing with those data. And here is where actually, when I'm talking about this too, in the context of this survey life cycle and trying to imagine how with the total survey error and with the survey process quality management, we can think from the data producer aspect of minimizing as many of the problems that we know are potential to appear. We talk about one type of strategy that is often employed in cross-national research, and in other comparative studies as well, but primarily in comparative research, is ex-ante harmonization. And I'm curious, how many of you have worked with this? I mean, when you're thinking about harmonization, what do you understand by this term? Harmonizing the concept? No.
I'm new.
You're new to the concept. Okay. Other people, have you come across the concept of survey harmonization?
Yeah, I'm just thinking from my program perspective, and we don't have this issue because of the way they are, and the questionnaires are pretty much the same. So,
but that's good because you are, in other words, you have already harmonized it. Yes.
Quite harmonized across the countries and the years. Yeah.
So when we're thinking, yes, because you see, one thing is when we're thinking about harmonization, it's basically taken from statistical offices, right, who want to standardize measurement. And it is when a way to try to define the term is as a set of procedures, and that these procedures aim to improve, if not to fully achieve, comparability of surveys over time, of surveys from different countries. It doesn't have to be only cross-national surveys. It is frequently applied in cross-national surveys, but it could be also within country over time that do the same thing. And then when we think from the point of view of the data producers, and what I would like actually, and I'm sure that for you it's obvious, but sometimes we tend to forget about it. We're saying data producers, perhaps forgetting that data producer is a label for an actually rather heterogeneous group of social actors, no? Because we have the principal investigators, but then we have the organizations that collect the data. And if there is a cross-national project, then there may be coordinators at the centrally located coordinators. So then there is quite an interaction of communication and exchanges of practices and of requirements within actually a network of data producers, which, depending on how many countries are involved in a cross-national project, could be actually very heterogeneous in the type of resources that national teams possess. Right? So if I can give you easily the example, in European Social Survey, Romania will always be lower in terms of certain level of resources compared to countries from Western Europe. Then actually what we have seen from different studies is that there is systematic differentiation between the countries, even if, I mean, to get to participate in cross-national survey projects, that generally countries that are poorer and that in which research infrastructure is not so developed are not that likely to be part of cross-national surveys to begin with. And if they are part of cross-national survey projects, in general, they tend to struggle more than countries with higher resources. So this is why I'm saying that when we're thinking about data producers are actually rather heterogeneous group, and that oftentimes some of the problems with survey quality, in a sense, get linked also to the differentiation within national teams of given survey projects, not only across survey projects. Anyway, when we're thinking about harmonization, there are, at the time of data producing, there are 2.5 main types: input harmonization, output harmonization, and the combinations thereof. And what you were saying before is input harmonization, that people, and this is what I understand that in your project that is being carried out, and actually many cross-national studies aim for this, that from the beginning, before at the stage of designing and planning the implementation of the research, they have the common concept, that they standardize the definition, they can have common measurements of the concepts, they have questions based on source questionnaire that is then being translated, and the translation needs to be checked in all the different languages. They have common training of national coordinators, and possibly some of them even of heads of data collection agencies, although this happens by subgroups. So some take translators and say, okay, we have common trainings for you, this is what you need to achieve. And then there are common technical requirements, that you have to achieve a certain minimal response rate, or you are not allowed to use quota sampling. Or you are not allowed to use random walk if you do not keep the addresses of the households at which you have been at. So I understand that this is the kind of harmonization that has been already implemented in the kind of data that you are being collected.
Correct. Yeah. We work through local country offices,
Mm-hmm.
country offices in all countries. So we train them,
Mm-hmm.
and they contract local building firms to basically distribute and for the field work to distribute and collect the questionnaires. But then we have a bit of an issue because capacity of these building firms is very different in different countries. Because in Romania it's one quality standard, while in Guinea or some small countries like Mauritius, basically there is only just one firm, and we are based in DC, and we don't have much control over their work.
Yes.
And the local office is supposed to oversee them, but their capacity also varies.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, and so then we have.
Well, actually, what you're touching is a main issue, and then I would be curious also whether you have experiences, or also the rest of you in this kind of collection, because indeed this is more of a top-down approach. So if you have a high central organization that is resourceful and powerful, it is more likely to work, but also conditioned on the interaction with the local national teams, which sometimes is not that smooth. And what have been your experiences in solving some of the communication problems?
Well, what we try to do, we try to make sure that at least the local coordinator from the bank's office is well trained, so he or she knows what to do and how to supervise this company on the ground. So they have a very clear terms of reference, basically what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. And then if the firms have questions, and quite often they have questions, we do video conferences. Of course, we respond to questions. We try to help as much as possible as we can. But yeah, still, since we use different methods for survey distribution and collection, because again, in Romania, probably people would prefer online at all levels, in all stakeholder groups, while in Liberia, people would still prefer paper and face-to-face sort of administration. So again, methods differ, privacy differs, but we try to make sure that at least coordinators do this quality control. Mm-hmm. And we have a control over the respondents list.
And
we provide
yes,
this respondents list. And since these are people, these are basically opinion leaders, and they're well-educated members.
Yes.
We don't have much of the problem in terms of completing questionnaires on data fraud. We still have it from time to time. I guess no one is secure from this, but not as much as in surveys of population.
What about in your study?
Generally, we do not control much. We do not have much control over overseas
But do you give them do you tell them how to measure what they measure, or each of the countries or the cultural groups within countries decide to use their own instruments and then map it into a common variable?
Basically, we control the questionnaire.
So you give them the questionnaire, and then it's in all these countries it's administered in Japanese, or it's being translated also? Okay. Well, I didn't know if they speak in all these countries. It's given only to Japanese nationals, or no? Okay. Because I thought that when you went to Brazil, it was given to the Japanese community of yes.
But maybe some very exceptional cases.
Mm-hmm.
We usually translate.
Okay.
We have control over them, but for example, field operation or something, survey administration aspect, we do not have much control, and just ask survey company which country to do the field work and just report how they did.
How they did the field work.
Yeah.
Yes. And for this project, the central administration is based in Japan.
Yeah, right.
What about you? What are you doing when you collect data?
Anytime that we've done anything comparative, we're always looking at data someone else has collected.
Mm-hmm.
And it's usually like compiling the background before doing something else. So we'd be trying to get a sense of like all the different surveys someone had done, like around public opinion on something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like it's cross-cultural, like really mostly of it's in Canada, but usually each survey would have been done within a respective province, which might be like quite different and have a bit of a different methodology. And then so we don't have any control in that case. And we're actually kind of like just lucky based on what those different companies decide to disclose. So we're trying to figure out whether or not one of their measures is comparable to another one, or if we're trying to answer a question that's maybe asked differently in different surveys, still try to get like a bit of a sense of how that compares.
Okay. Yes, so this is indeed, then there is these are the problems that how do you integrate the national teams such that they trust enough that they report not only what goes well, but also what doesn't go well, or the local regional teams, which also happens.
We ask for lessons from each way.
And do they come, are they visited by the central offices on a regular basis? Do you send people into the countries? Do they come to visit the headquarters?
Basically, these local coordinators, they are
Yes.
based in world bank offices in these countries. So they oversee building farms activities.
Yes, but I guess what I was asking is whether in Washington, whether at any point is there meeting between people in Washington and representatives of the data collection organizations?
No, we don't.
No. Okay.
Sometimes we do, like I said, we do video conferences by their request, but not. We don't.
Well, actually now with Skype it becomes nicer.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, then the second type of harmonization at the stage of planning and data processing is the so-called ex-ante output harmonization. And you mentioned actually that in World Bank it is done to some extent, in that what this means is that teams agree on the common concept and that there will be a certain measurement schema, but local teams are allowed to use their own survey items to collect the data. And then at the stage of data processing, basically they recode the data that they collected with their own instruments into a schema that would be common across all the, let's say if we talk about countries, across all the national surveys. And this is why I asked you a little bit earlier if it was about education, because yes, we're saying, well, education is in all countries and everybody understands the issue of education, but how education is structured in given countries differs very much, right? We can think about Germany, where if you in 4th grade, you do not go into a certain type of educational path, you're screwed, because chances that you go to universities are almost disappearing. Whereas in countries like Romania or Poland, this kind of tracking system does not exist. So then what happens is that although we find in international surveys this international standard classification of education, actually projects have realized that it is better to allow for the richness of the data to be collected using the best instrument existing within that particular cultural context. And therefore, you would see in the European Social Survey that they have the harmonized education variable, but they also have the national specific classifications of education. And this is actually for a very useful approach. And it can be mixed, and this takes us to the hybrid option, where you have ex-ante harmonization of output, but also input harmonization, because European Social Survey also harmonizes a lot at the stage of design, but where you allow some of the national variation to come in and to not be lost by standardizing certain concepts or processes or phenomena that you know are actually very differentiated across the cultural entities. And this is what seems to me that you were also saying when you were talking about the fact that some questions would ask in certain fashions, whereas other would not. But then would they provide a common variable across the data, or is just that some keep some items and others don't? Yes, well, there is, in a sense, with this X-output harmonization, some surveys go entirely this way, and they say, you know what, actually, you do not need to harmonize anything at the input stage. There is no need for common questionnaire that then should be translated, because, and the argument pertains especially to sociodemographics, like education, occupation, income. Actually, the local experts in the given countries, whether it's statistical offices and social scientists, have by now developed the classification schema that would work best for their given society. And this is why education is one example, but we can think about class schema also, that in post-communist societies, the class schema would look, although, right, class schema are based on occupational codes, right? But how you group these occupational codes may be different across cultural and socioeconomic contexts, that in post-communist societies, you have a different pooling of these occupational codes into different class categories than you would have in traditional Western full capitalist societies, for example. So then there is some view that actually perhaps some data could be left or collected, that even though there is no input harmonization, with ex-ante output harmonization, because concepts are there and we know that we have a common definition for them, later on what we can take is these commonly mapped variables and analyze them together. But they're generally I would say most researchers who do cross-national analysis do not go fully for this support, do not fully support this kind of view, that they'd rather argue for a mixture of input harmonization and ex-ante output harmonization. And maybe here is a good time, before I go into this, first to ask if you want a break. To ask people if they want a break, because now, as from here on, up to now, I was talking mostly from the point of view of data producer, how we are thinking about the problems of survey quality, what are the challenges with trying to envision all the sources where these problems come in, how harmonization can help, because it allows us both to achieve comparability at the definitional stage of concepts, of instruments, and then it allows us to think about functional equivalence of measurement, and it allows actually especially input harmonization, but to a good extent, or for certain concepts also ex-ante output harmonization, to think about what would be the standardized, what degree of standardization would be implemented at the data production and collection stage. Then the question is, how much is achieved in practice? And how do we know how much is achieved in practice? And this is what I would like to talk afterwards from the point of view of data user view. So I don't know, are there any questions up to now? Here, now I want to come in from the point of view of the data user and talk about this project that we have been working on since, I don't know, 2013, first under a Polish grant, now with money from the National Science Foundation in the States. And what is project? Let me try to say it in this way. Why I talk about it in terms of quality? Well, because when we're thinking as data users, we come to the data thinking that either we take the data for granted, that they are of good quality and comparable, or we want to understand what these data are about, and therefore we need documentation. Now, when we started this project, and this is important, again, it leads to the beginning of my discussion, that a lot for us, I mean for the group that I'm part of, is driven by substantive question. And when we first started with this project, we were interested in the relationship between democracy as a country characteristic or country year characteristic and political participation. And we were interested in participation in demonstrations, signing petitions, contacting politicians. And we wanted variation across time, and we wanted variation across countries in terms of levels of democracies. So it was becoming immediately clear then that working only with European Social Survey, which is very nice in terms of having strong data, is not tenable, because then we are bound to Europe only, and not only that, but Europe since 2002. And therefore we decided, okay, because we are interested in these relationships across countries, but not only Europe, and across time, even if it's Europe, but not only the 2002, because a lot of democratization happened in the 90s, we decided, let's try to take data from different cross-national survey projects. How do you do that? Well, you do it in this framework of ex-post harmonization. And ex-post harmonization basically is a type of reprocessing existing survey data. And what does it mean? Well, it means that assuming that you are comfortable and confident that your concepts are common across the national surveys that you want to pull, and that you would be able to adjust those variables from data sets not a priori designed to be comparable in such a way that you can build a new data set where you have this common measure for all data sets that you pulled in, then you go to do it. So, but what I'm trying to say here is that it is very difficult to think of starting harmonization ex post without knowing what is your research interest, because you cannot harmonize everything that is in all these data sets. It takes a very long time to harmonize. Therefore, you have to understand what outcome are you interested in, and what are the correlates, what are the main individual level variables that you want to study. And then you go for it. You go for it for the substantive research, but, and this is what we found out as we were working from it, you go for it also because of the methodological research that actually starting such exercises allows you to open, which probably I don't think, for me, definitely I would have not dreamt doing. But we're saying, okay, think about it. No, there are all these projects, and now I'm talking about the World Value Survey and the International Social Survey Project and the European Social Survey. They all ask about, for example, have you participated in demonstrations? Do you trust your institutions? I don't know, do you like foreigners? As example, we don't deal with these variables. Can these data be used together so that you can have a better grasp presuming that you know the context that you're studying, which always is crucial, of what happens at a comparative level. And here I thought that this would be nice just to show you what is the coverage. The darker the color, the gray, the darker the gray, the more national surveys are available for a given country in a given continent. And on the left hand of the picture, of the screen, as I'm facing it, is coverage in the World Value Survey and in the European Value Survey, right? One of the broadest, if we want to think of data sets that collects data across the world.
You mean the coverage of general issues like trust?
And at this point, this is only with regards to the national data sets that are available, and World Value Survey asks these questions. But at this point, it is, do national surveys exist in World Value Survey? And roughly speaking, in what number? And this you can see in the left-hand side of the picture. And we have in certain regions, we have nothing, like in the middle of Africa, it's white entirely. And then as the gray gets darker, this is how we have more national surveys within World Value Survey in the left-hand side of the project, of the picture. And then in the right-hand side of the picture, we have plotted the national surveys that actually we pulled from different projects. And you see that coverage becomes better, which in a sense, if people are interested in using countries and doing like panel analysis, that if you have repeated cross-sectional, this is a nice feature to have. There are also some empty spots being filled, but we also saw that no matter, although here we took 22 international survey projects among, and I will show you soon which ones we took, some parts of the world still remain white, which is what I was talking before, that for whatever systematic reasons, some countries are not represented in cross-national surveys. And this leads to the question that many ask, is it better to work with any data that we can find on given countries because at least we learn something? Or do we say, no, I do not touch these data are not of good quality, they are not of high standards, I will not be working with them. And this, in a sense, it's almost like a philosophical question. How much compromise are we willing to do between hoping to learn something versus keeping the data to certain standards? Now, so we started with this idea that we should reprocess data, but we realized very soon that the data, as I was saying, and this before we even did systematic analysis, we realized that the data are quite varied in terms of what is in there. So how to think about it? And this is why actually we ended up calling it survey data recycling. We were not willing to throw out the poorer quality data. We thought, let's try to envision if there is a possibility in which variability that comes into the data because of methodological differentiation can be measured, and can be measured not only in the sense of that, okay, I can see that the documentation is poorer or there are duplicates, but can I create some variables that then I can put into the data set that I'm building with these common measures across the data, and that later on I can use in models so that at least part of the variation that stems from the different samples that surveys have, or from the fact that some surveys control for field work but others don't, or from the fact that some surveys tell me that they had translation and others don't, can I partial out some of this variation if I store this information as variables? And this is, in a sense, the main idea behind in terms of theoretical framework of how we approach this playing with existing data. We said, okay, we know that there are deviations from common standards, from documenting and preparing source survey data. Such differentiation ties to survey quality. Let's see if we can identify it and measure it. And this is why we were saying, okay, we will try to measure quality of the source surveys, and we will try to capture as much of the properties of the source items. Source items are those that you originally work in from the national surveys when we transform recode, or whatever we do to the variables so that we create a common variable across the data. And this is why we ended up with two types of controls: controls for source survey quality and controls for the process of ex-post harmonization. I will not talk about ex-post harmonization controls today. I will talk about source quality. But of course, if you have questions, we can see where this takes us. These are the data that the data sets that we worked with. 23 of them right now, and this means about 142 countries and about 3,400 national surveys. Now we have the analysis that I will show you soon are done on a subset of the data. But how did we choose? Why did we take this data and not others? Well, we had certain criteria. First of all, they had to have indicators of political behaviors and attitudes. So the first thing was, are there substantive items of interest and main individual correlates? Then they should be non-commercial, because we didn't have money to pay for them. Are they freely available in the public domain? They should have English language documentation, right? We do not know the many national languages that surveys have. So they should have English language documentation. And they should state that their samples are intended as representative of the national population. We will see soon that what they say is perhaps not necessarily as what is in the data, and they should be, this is what I said, non-commercial, but also by non-commercial, I meant that we were hoping that if we go for heavy academic leaning survey projects, the care in input harmonization and ex-ante output harmonization would be there to a larger extent, because when we started this work, we built on the assumption that within project, so within Asia Barometer, within Caucasus Barometer, they already harmonized at least the concepts. In other words, they were confident that these concepts exist in all countries in which they administer the questions to. For us, it would have been impossible to question this assumption. So this is why we're thinking, okay, if we go with the academic surveys, maybe we are stronger leaning in this assumption. And the analysis that I will show you soon, immediately, are done on a subset of this data. So these data that I will show you the analysis for span from 1966 to 2012, the end of 2012. And we have not taken all waves and all files in each and every single survey project, because they were not having some of the questions, the substantive questions that we were interested in. This is why you will see that for Afrobarometer, for example, we took everything. But for the Americas Barometer, we didn't take everything. Or for World Value Survey, also we didn't take everything. Now we took waves that at that time had the variables that we were interested in. And then the question was, okay, we have all this data and we are thinking about survey quality. How, as a secondary user, can you systematically evaluate it backwards, as it would be? And therefore, this is why I was saying that actually this total survey error and survey quality frameworks were not bad, because they allowed us to try to think conceptually of 3 dimensions of quality. One dimension that was reflected in the survey documentation as such, because if the information in the documentation sucks, then the confidence in the data also goes down, right? Or sometimes I may not even be able to make sense of what is in the data if the documentation is so poor. So this is one dimension that we defined when approaching this. A second dimension was processing errors. Let's try to think in terms of survey quality as the consistency between what the documentation tells us that is in the data and what the data records in the computer file actually show us. And the reason was that, you know, if you have processing errors, then the usability of the survey goes down. And then let's look at the quality of the data records in the national data sets themselves. So for us, this is, you know, in terms of conceptualization, these were the 3 dimensions that this total survey error and survey quality process management frameworks were helpful in allowing us to think on theoretical level. Then was the issue, okay, these are the dimensions. What indicators could we develop and how that we would go back later on to the data in order to code the data with respect to these 3 dimensions? And we decided that we will have indicators for variability of quality of survey documentation, and I will show you what this meant. We will want indicators for inconsistency between data and description in the data files, and also indicators for quality of data records in the computer files. Now, again, documentation is both a process and the outcomes of this process. So what to take, what to code, given that you go through the documentation is generally at the national survey level. So if we were lucky, some of the projects were providing the documentation at the wave level. So that means that, okay, you look through one document and maybe you find information about 6 countries in 1 year. But oftentimes the documentation was at the national level. So you would go for each country in a given wave to look through all the documentation in order to see whether you find, whether you are able to code what. This is what we decided to code. Type of sampling schema. And at that point, this is work that actually right now we are adjusting. We decided, okay, the documentation tells me nothing about the sampling schema, or it tells me so little that I cannot say what kind of sampling these data sets use. It uses multi-stage unknown probability sample, quota, random route, but here we did not differentiate, and we will go back because there could be random route that was in stratified random sampling or not, and in this particular instance we did not differentiate it, but now we do. Multi-stage address, multi-stage individual register, or simple or stratified random sample. This is what we were looking for, whether the documentation talks about, whether it is possible to identify from the documentation. And by documentation, I mean what? Anything we could get our hands on. Technical reports, methodological reports, anything. That questionnaires, sometimes code books, depending on where this information was available. And then we were breaking this down also into 5 dichotomous variables. Does the survey documentation specify the type of sample that was used? Yes or no? Does the survey documentation tell me what the response rate was? Yes, no. Does the documentation tell me whether the translation was checked in any fashion? Because again, remember that these are cross-national surveys. Now, if the survey was in a country that was by default in English or in French, because some questionnaires were developed as source questionnaires in a different language, we would not penalize that country. They would get 1. Is there any evidence? Do they tell us that the questionnaire was pre-tested? And do they say anything about fieldwork control? Now we also code whether what is the interview mode. So for these new sets of data, we are also coding the interview mode, and then try to see in relation to whether they talk about interview mode together with specific type of fieldwork control. But this is still ongoing. And then the idea was, okay, if you have positive answers, you have higher confidence in the data. Okay, let's see what we find. This is only for a subset of the data. So we take 2 projects that are not that unheard of: European Social Survey, European Quality of Life, and International Social Survey. And here you see, in International Social Survey program, for the amount of projects that we had taken, and we can scroll up if you want, 39% of them did not tell us what sampling method that they were using. If you're thinking, you know, we talk about the claim that these are nationally representative samples, but it is not possible to say actually in 39% of these data sets that come from ISSP, what sampling schema they use. This is why, again, when we're talking about documentation is actually...
Was there like a pattern in that? Have they added it recently?
This was actually, I would make a caveat here. I was saying that for this data set, we were taking only, let's see if I can go here. We were taking only a subset of the ISSP program. So we had only 13 waves and files for from altogether 363. Now in the new data we have taken all. So I would be able to respond if there is a pattern maybe in a month from now or thereabout.
They dropped it or if they added it.
Yes. Here is actually response rate by project. And in a sense broken down a little bit, and here we see that some projects did not provide response rate at all, like there was nothing regardless of which data set we looked at. These were America's barometer, Asia, Europe survey, and so on, those at the bottom. But otherwise we see that we have some like Afrobarometer, which is very good in telling us what the response rate is. To other data sets were not so well. That, in other words, that there is quite a bit of variation. Now we know that response rate by itself doesn't mean anything, right? So there is a response rate, but actually what matters more is also what are the characteristics of non-respondents. And this we cannot tell. And actually, this is what we also try to code now to see to what extent they tell us what, if there are certain systematic features of non-respondents. But that will be even more chaotic than what we see here. But anyway, overall, what we see over this, so pulling all this data together, in 68% of these 1,720 national surveys that come from 89 waves, 68% do not tell us whether questionnaire was pre-tested. Now we are saying that, you know, the data, you need to know how good your questionnaire is, especially when it has been translated. We don't know. Maybe they pre-tested it. All I can say is that for me as a secondary user, documentation is my only window in the survey production process. And I don't know. 62% no information about fieldwork control. Was there any fieldwork done? We have no idea. 49% no information on response rates. And in about 28% of this data, sampling information either was not reported or it was so poor that we had no idea what kind of sampling is done. But the picture is not so bad, because if we look over time, actually, we see that there is an improve. So this is smoothed, like this is, so for this graph, we created an index out of those 5 variables unweighted. So either one of the answers is 1, then they would adding, so the index ranges from 0 to 5. And this was smoothed by computing 3-year moving averages, because we did not have data in each and every year. But altogether, we can say that there is not bad, right? So it is improving, okay. So this was with regards to documentation. Then what we did is, let's go back and see what happens with processing errors. Now, processing errors, we cannot do it for all the variables that we are harmonizing. Therefore, we took the demographics, gender, age, year of birth, education, and then education you have in both years and levels. And then we took 2 substantive variables, trust in parliament, in participation in demonstrations. And we looked whether there is discrepancy between data records and codebook questionnaire, then we coded, okay, are there illegitimate variable values? Are there misleading variable values? So basically these 5 issues, which altogether we put into an index. Number of mistakes per wave, because this information was generally at the wave level, which we divided by the number of source variables within a particular wave, because this number of source variables may vary across waves. Not all waves may have all the variables that we were looking at, all the 7. So what you need to remember here only is that 0 is better quality, and in other words, the lower the number, the better the quality. The higher the number, the poorer the quality. And here is done within, you see that we have the Asia Barometer Wave 2, Asia Barometer Wave 3, for example. And we see that there, and then also different projects that are done different waves. So what I'm trying to show here with these numbers is that variation is not only between survey projects. Variation is also within survey projects. And this makes it also, you know, back to this idea, do we throw out data that perhaps may not be deemed of certain standards, or do we try to recycle them? Do we try to reuse them if we store such information as control variables? How to think about that? Now, with the thing with processing quality is that it goes worse through time. Contrary to documentation, actually older projects were much better at having consistency between their documentation. They were, especially the early ones, the political action studies of the 60s and 70s, they were great in terms of the consistency between data and documentation. So when we're looking at this dimension of quality, we see that actually problems increase over time. Lower numbers here mean fewer problems, higher numbers mean more problems. And then we look at data records in computer files. So what did we check here? We look, do survey cases have unique identification numbers? In other words, is there anything wrong with survey IDs? Are survey weights free of formal error? So here, basically, the comparison was with 1, whether the mean was 1 and how much the standard deviation was differing from that, in the idea that they should not inflate the sample size. Is the proportion of missing values for gender and age not larger than 5%? And are there no duplicates in the data, no non-unique records? This is what we try to look for when looking in the data records themselves. And since I was afraid that here we may spend the whole day otherwise, I showed only perhaps the most glaring, that how is it possible to have 100% missing on age or 100% missing on gender? It does happen. Yes, it does happen. And actually, yes, but not something that you would think a priori, right? Who would think of how, I mean, I don't think I would have thought that I should check. I mean, I guess it would show up in analysis, but I would have not thought a priori that somebody would have 100% missing on gender or on age. No. And then there is actually, there is quite a nice analysis done on non-unique records. But and here this paper, this is actually Maciek Fomczynski is one of the principal investigators of this project. And together with two of our colleagues, Przemek Powałko and Ted Krauze, they have wrote these papers on non-unique records in international survey projects. The paper can be downloaded from the internet. It's freely available in order to see actually what are the patterns. There are, what happens is once we identified non-unique records, we contacted the projects, and most of them were very glad that we told them about, and they corrected and put errata in the data and acknowledge the information. And what was actually also interesting is that in some instances, although the proportion of non-unique records was actually high, it was random. So either people who were falsifying the data did it very well and knew that they should just randomly duplicate interviews, or maybe it was not duplicated and it was just copy and paste mistake, but in some random fashion, because it did not matter for substantive results. In other parts, it mattered. But this is why I was saying that for this presentation, it may have been a little bit too much, but the paper is freely available. Then one more thing that could be interesting is we looked at the correlation of these indicators in the data, in the pooled data, taking into consideration the indices. So when we had the documentation, we took the index. When we had processing error, we took the index, and then we also created an index for data records in the computer file. And then we did pairwise coefficients for the different indices, and we saw that actually the correlation is not too high. and actually in some instances almost 0, which for us was good news because we were thinking that actually these are different dimensions of quality, and the data show that indeed these are, I mean, in some instances they are related somewhat, but or in the other one it's almost 0, so that we're talking about different dimensions of quality. So this is, again, from the user perspective, going backwards and trying to see, is there any way, and what I want to make clear here, that certainly this is not exhaustive way to measure possible errors in the data. It is a tremendous effort. You probably, I mean, it doesn't take that much to figure out, right, that it was a tremendous amount of work to go to this, but many more of the components, for example, if we think from the taxonomy of total survey error, perhaps could be captured. But it means two things. Either it means that people are willing to go backwards and do it, or, and this is where we hope that perhaps data producers may want to think about it, but it's also a matter of how we make their life easier, is that they record this information themselves as variables at the moment of data production. Because imagine that when you compile your documentation, you can also put as variable, yes, response rate is this, or yes, we did control field work, or yes, we have these interview modes, one for internet, one that this information is stored as variables that afterwards can be provided together with the data files themselves. That makes the life of, I think, also data producers easier, but certainly in terms of the transparency of the data production process and for the information from the point of view of the user, it would be a fantastic resource also from the point of view of methodological research. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is we played, but this is still in preliminary research. Does it matter? Does it matter that these projects are of different quality, and how to think about it? Well, we thought, well, there are two ways in we can think about it. One would be, let's have a weak expectation. So if these quality variables, by Q, I mean these quality variables, are not random, the weak expectation would be, if the quality matters, then these variables would not be randomly distributed with respect to some substantive relationship. Then a stronger expectation would be that if you have higher data quality, based on the indicators that we were able to take in, then we would have more consistent estimates with respect to these substantive variables. And can we check for this in the data? Well, the reason why we were able to do that is that let's start for the weak expectation. We said, okay, let's look what is the impact of each variable, of the quality control variable, on participation in demonstrations, which for us was one of the variables that we started to begin with, to harmonize. And I'm specifying here that we took participation in demonstration in last 10 years, because actually there is a lot of question wording. So for simplicity reasons, we took only this one, which we call ever. And these are two-level models. But one is in countries, and in other one is in country years. And what I was thinking to say here is only that what can be said here is that there is it's difficult to say that there is no systematic pattern, right? We see that, okay, the coefficients are not large, but what happens is that in both instances, we have the unstandardized coefficients, that accuracy and quality, as we measure them, are not randomly distributed on the individual level likelihood of demonstrating. One that didn't matter, and that was the data documentation. But for processing errors and the data records themselves, there was some systematic pattern. Again, these were on a subset of the data.
Just let me confirm the variables are used as a regulatory.
Yes. And this was okay. This was the weak expectation. Then the stronger thing, and that was more difficult, was would this, if we control for data quality, would the estimates be more consistent when we look at substantive variables? And how to check this? Well, for some of the data, we have pairs of surveys. In other words, for the same country in the same year, we have more than one national survey. So this is why I gave an example. In Slovakia in 91, we have the European Value Study, but then also we have the same country in the same year covered in International Social Survey Project. And altogether, we have 72 pairs of surveys, which will constitute our units of observation. And for these 72 pairs of surveys, we looked at the difference in proportion of respondents who said that they demonstrate. So this gets me back to this idea of point estimates and what happens when we aggregate data and how comfortable are we when we use proportions to plot trends over time. So we had differences for the same country in the same year that there was no difference, but there was 31 percentage points difference, and this is the graph. Yeah? Now, it is true that there may be triggering effects, right? That maybe there was something in these countries that the difference is substantive. And actually, we had one of our graduate students, I don't have the results here, go for each of these pairs of countries and check if in that given year, the news were talking about some major event. And in most of the instances, we did not find anything that would justify on theoretical reason this variation. So then what did we do? Okay, well, we said we just did at this point something very, very basic, namely, we looked at the difference. So we looked at the difference in the mean value of participation in demonstrations for these pairs of surveys. And we controlled for data documentation for these three types of indices. And again, we did it twice in two ways. First, without controlling for sampling method difference, and then controlling for difference in sampling method. And we see that generally what happens is that the same with documentation, actually not much is going on, but actually with accuracy, so with processing error and with the quality of computer files, means get closer. So basically, when you have better data, the relationship, the difference of the two estimates around the mean is smaller. In other words, that it seems that there is a little bit less variability in the estimates when you have better quality of the data. But again, this is rather preliminary remarks. So then, in terms of these illustrations, what are the points? The points are that the differences are not only within projects, but also across, not only between projects, but also across projects. That these dimensions of quality do not correlate highly, that they are not exhaustive, and that there may be many other indicators that could be constructed within this dimension. And that when we're thinking about transparency of the comparative survey research, we have to understand that this transparency pertains from the point of data producers and data users. And that from data producer side, again, the survey life cycle means documentation, and how this documentation can be accessed, how much common standards are found across documentation, makes a heck of a difference later on for data reprocessing and ex-post harmonization, although perhaps data producers at the point where they collected the data may not have even thought that somebody would want to later on work in this fashion with their data. But also what is very important, that harmonization procedures within data collection and ex-post need to be documented, and there has to be transparency of all the transformations and all the processes that are done in order to create this data that should facilitate cross-national survey research, if we are to talk about, again, about survey quality and then later on about comparability. And currently, if we are looking, and this would be something that is also very useful in terms of sources for information, the Consortium for European Social Data Archives, I do not know, CESDA, if you are familiar with it, and the Data Documentation Initiative, actually have started putting out a lot of tools, software tools that are free of charge that should aid documentation, and by this meaning not only talking about the data collection process, but also creating standardized code books and reporting information in more standardized fashion. But there is nothing currently on harmonization, and now I mean ex-ante harmonization, whether it's input harmonization or ex-post output harmonization. And this is something that data producers need to keep in mind, because oftentimes it falls to the cracks, and it's very difficult to go post factum to retrace all the steps that went into the production of those data. The same thing holds for ex-post harmonization. So if you are interested, those of you who are interested to taking data that were collected from different sources and bringing them together, you know, this is a very, I don't know, in one glance picture of what is done when you do ex-post harmonization. Everything has to be documented. And this is in this project that we're doing, we try to put as much as we can online and freely available for others. This is why we have, although it was only how do you call it, the first version of the database, but with the database and the documentation, it's freely available via Harvard Dataverse, or from us if people email us. But with the understanding that actually the workflow of the entire ex-post harmonization project also needs to be documented if we are talking about transparency, and by this meaning that others can judge what we're doing and how we're doing it. So, in terms of what I was saying, that is it, maybe to see what your comments are, whether this is what you imagined of harmonization ex-post, whether you thought about it differently, I don't know. I mean, it's again, the focus here was from thinking about harmonization ex-post from the point of view of how to deal with variability in source survey quality, rather than how we're doing the harmonization as such. If you want to stay longer, I can talk about that as well, or we can go to a tea or a coffee or something. But from the point of view of survey quality, for us, in order to deal with this variability, our solution was to construct measures, and then to see whether these measures work. And this would be the hope that actually perhaps there is the possibility that data producers too can think whether some of the information that total survey error allows to think in terms of these taxonomies of all the possible errors that come in can be recorded as variables.
Do you feel like the variables that you tested and constructed for this one are somewhat exhaustive, or sort of a starting point?
Oh, they are not exhaustive. No, they are definitely not exhaustive. And they are, again, thinking about how we decided to code this. Well, for documentation, we went to the textbooks and said, what are the key elements of survey design and implementation that you would want to know about, and that the literature talks that brings errors in. This is why we talk about sampling, fieldwork, and so on. Data processing, which you know, there are a multitude of data processing problems that come, but we were thinking, well, what makes life difficult for users? What makes life difficult for users is that if you do not know what value labels and variable labels are, whether the value labels are in reversed order or completely non-understandable. In other words, what makes it more difficult for the user to work with the data?
So with the measures, reading that correctly, you find like it was sort of a direct relationship between, say, the measure of participation in a demonstration with the quality of the survey? What
we found is not that a measure of participation, because the one proportion, if I have only one survey, I cannot estimate. But what we did is we looked at the difference between the mean or the proportion in two surveys that were conducted in the same country in the same year. Again, assuming, and this we checked the assumption, assuming that there were no substantive reasons that this difference should be there. that you know, that I don't know, there was some crazy thing, and like in Orban, that he all of a sudden he decided to not allow people to study gender studies anymore, and then people took to the streets. Then of course there would be a jump in demonstration. Yeah. But what we saw is that when you control for these quality indicators for 2 out of 3, actually the difference between the 2 estimates shrinks on average. This is what we found. So in this, but these are only some preliminary analysis. Then there were other people that use these controls also a little bit differently, because you can use the controls also as filters. If you have this kind of information, if my analysis, if for whatever reason I'm interested really in generalizability of results, and I want to generalize from my sample to the population, then most likely I would not be comfortable or I may not want to use samples that are of a particular kind, where I do not know any information about their sampling time. Then if I have such information in the data set, I can simply filter those data out and say, well, actually for this analysis and for this research purpose, I want the samples on which I know. Or I can do something else. I can say, let's see how robust my results are if I'm estimating these relationships, whatever those relationships are, in data that come from samples that vary on this criteria of quality, versus, so that I take only what I would say are the highest quality, versus where I allow the quality to lax. Do I find the same relationships, right? So if this information is available as variable in the data set, I think that people can play a lot with checking various robustness of results, which otherwise would be much more difficult to get at. But this is why I'm saying, are these indicators exhaustive? Definitely not. And how easy is it to create them retrospectively? Very difficult in terms of time and manpower. This is why we added some, and for this field work, a mode of interview mode was actually a basic thing that we had to take into consideration, and we took it. But this is why actually from this point of view, it is so much easier if this kind of variables would be available from the point of view of data producers, that they would record this information as such. And this is when we're thinking, what can large infrastructure organizations like CESDA do for the international research community? Well, one thing that they can do is actually they can make free software available to data producers, where actually recording this information becomes easier. Because at this point, I do not know, have any of you looked at the data documentation initiative? Let's try this. No. Yes?
Definitely.
And what did you think? Was it easy? Was it difficult? What did you think?
Difficult.
Yes, I say the same thing. I looked at it and I realized that it's like speaking a foreign language.
Right.
Yes, so if we are thinking about saying, well, okay, data producers should standardize the way they communicate within the network, but also from the network to outside users, then there should be perhaps some more effort put from the major research infrastructures to actually lower the burden of documentation and of standardization on data producers. And from this point of view, this idea of trying to think how to develop certain open source freely available software tools, because there are some, but they are for payment, like Coltrica also is developed within DDI, that supposedly makes this easier. I have not paid the license to see how it works, but I understood from somebody, some people's presentation, that is not bad. But that actually it is possible in the age of crowdsourcing that actually free software tools could be made available, so people can document in more standardized fashion and easier, in order to allow more transparency, again, both within the network and across the network. And for us as secondary users now, with this ex-post harmonization of survey data, currently, the way intellectual property works is that you cannot redistribute the source data. Although unless you're doing it on one person basis that you want to share the data within a research project. So what we can only share, so what I can share as when I harmonize data is a new data file with only the harmonized variables, the control variables for the source data quality and for the harmonization process, with a clear metadata as to which version of the given project wave I have used in those data, and then the code that I use, so then people can check, replicate if they want. But there is an added difficulty to this, because in our project we work with a computer scientist who uses MySQL, which is open source free software, but still you would have to know it in order to be able to replicate the coding. So it's not that it is in Stata syntax or in R syntax from the beginning. We didn't know how to solve this problem given how much data there were, how much data management was required, and that we needed to have a little bit of help from somebody who was working with this data on much quicker basis. Was this the optimal decision? I don't know. So perhaps we would need somebody who would take this code and translate it either into Stata or in R, so people can rerun the code immediately. Although, you know, the code is available freely in MySQL, but people would have to know how to take that and translate it into Stata or R. So, I don't know what your experience is if you harmonize it also. If you take data from different surveys, what do? You do it in Stata, you do it in R from the beginning?
Definitely in R.
Mm-hmm.
R plays pretty nicely with SQL. So.
Mm-hmm. That's what we were hoping, that MySQL would be, for people who use R, this would be rather straightforward. For people who use Stata, it's more difficult.
Yeah, I'm sure there's an R command that's just SQL, proper SQL, like translates it.
Yes, so for us, yes, this is the issue of making as much as possible sharing anything we do, except what we are not allowed to share, which is the source data. Though again, then the question is, why would the data producers like World Value Survey or European Social Survey not agree to share the source data, because you share it only with the link and with the mentioning of the data. But this is what the policies are, so this is all that we can do. Well, so we have much more information about harmonization, and you know, if you have any questions, we would gladly talk about it in terms of how we harmonize and how we rescale, and you know, why we do scales in certain fashion rather than in others, and how we actually what to do with these differences between source items, you know, because there are differences in source items with respect to wording. There are differences between source items with respect to scales. I don't remember. There are others. So how to deal with this, and why we create certain control variables, and how these control variables have been used or can be used. So, and a lot of information, I think, is on the website of the project, which, by the way, yes, there is also this.
Are you going to circulate?
Yes. Yes.
Right?
Yes, you're right. I should also, definitely, yes. I will put my information. I'm one of the principal investigators for this SDR project. And we gladly talk for anybody who wants to listen to us. I mean, when people have similar interests, it's, you know, we struggle with many things, and we like to hear from people. Actually, we also have a newsletter that we started in 2015 on harmonization of survey data, also in the hope that there may be others out there, that if we send some, you know, a bottle in the water, they would we will hear from others, and then one can learn from the other one. So we encourage people, if they have projects that they harmonize, to let us know, and we gladly write about them, and then we have meetings, and I don't know, we try to talk and to learn from others, and to see if our work can be useful to anybody else. So yes, there is a lot of practical things that we have in terms of how to harmonize, how to do these crosswalk tables, the workflow of harmonization, which perhaps may be useful. We are aware of the difficulties. Again, documentation is not easy. And again, the easiest thing is think about your syntax. You're thinking, okay, I write now and I will remember. And you go back to your syntax a year later, and what was it that I was doing here? Why? Right? And with documentation, it is exponentially more difficult because we document for future unknown users. And to anticipate what is needed and to be so disciplined as to record everything. This is why actually I think that speaking of documentation, I don't know if I have it here. Yes, this one. I found this very useful in terms of thinking how to organize the documentation of a project. That there are the different levels in which information comes in. That there is the information at the project level, there is the information at the file level, there is information at the variable level, then there is the information that data archives use, but then there are paradata, and then there is this so-called ancillary documentation like the interviewer training manual, which for many people is very important because of paradata. Then there is questionnaires in national languages, which again become important when we realize, which sometimes we don't realize from the beginning, that actually the source questionnaire may not be actually reflecting the scale that was used in the national survey. In terms of standardizing at least the information that can go into this documentation, this schema that basically draws on data archives organization for me was very useful to have. Well, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
I have, they asked me, the organizers, they have these pieces of paper that they said people maybe would like to fill out, since it's public opinion, they should not refuse. They should not refuse. So my email address is tomescu.1@osu.edu. And you can find this information both from concert.osu.edu or from the project's website. But I think that if you put survey data harmonization in Google, it may show up, I don't know. And actually, I'm serious. I would like to invite all of you, if you have, I do not know if internet works here. Supposedly I will take this. I don't know. I'll give them to Claire probably. Well, thank you. And again, please take, if you have something about harmonization, it doesn't have to be a large project, and you want people to know, write to me. And this newsletter is twice a year. In 2015 we send it. And if you go to Concierge, you'll find it over there. If not, I can email you the link just that you see a little bit what it is. It's not a long thing to write about, just that it's a description of your project is generally within less than 500 words or 1,000 words, depending on how long people want to write. And then others hear about you and know where to find you and what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I got all these? Okay. These ones. Okay, thank you. So it would be very interesting to hear from your project. So if you really, if you want to, if you would be willing to contribute to this newsletter, a description of this project, this would be fantastic.